The slap came from a 4-year-old hand. Not a hard slap, not the kind that leaves a mark for days, but hard enough to sting and to make the whole room go silent for a split second. Then my nephew lifted his chin, looked right at me with those round, innocent eyes, and said, "Mommy says you deserve it because you're a brokey." Nobody moved. A fork stopped halfway to a mouth. Someone laughed too quickly, like they didn't know what else to do. My cheek burned, my ears went hot, and in that tiny second, before anyone could pretend they hadn't heard, I understood exactly where those words had come from. Not from a child, from my mother. Her name is Gina, and if there is one thing she has always loved more than attention, it's the sound of her own joke landing. Or, if it didn't land, she'd keep talking until the room felt too awkward not to laugh. Gina had spent years doing open mics in bars that smelled like spilled beer and old fryer grease, calling herself a comedian because 3 drunk people had once clapped after a 5-minute set. She had never truly made it, never booked real venues, never built an actual audience, never got past the stage where people smiled out of pity or confusion. But she never let that stop her from acting like she was the funniest person alive. And she was funny in the cruelest way possible, at least to her. That counted. She treated embarrassment like currency. If someone else was bleeding, she could make a punchline out of it. If someone else was hurting, she could turn it into a story. If she had to choose between protecting somebody's dignity and getting a laugh, she would pick the laugh every single time and call it honesty. Growing up with her meant growing up under a spotlight I never asked for. When I wet the bed at 7, she didn't comfort me. She retold it at my birthday party, in front of cousins and neighbors, like it was a cherished family classic. Everyone laughed while I sat there frozen with frosting on my plate. When I got my first period at school and bled through my pants, I came home in tears. She listened for half a minute, then turned it into a story she used for months. My daughter thought red pants were a fashion statement, she'd say, and the room would erupt while I stared at the floor and wished I could disappear. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to what she did at my engagement party. I had been with Luke for 4 years by then. 4 years of late-night takeout, shared bank statements, bad movies, and all the ordinary little promises that slowly build a life. He was steady in a way I had never known was possible. Calm, reliable, kind, the sort of man who listened when you spoke and remembered the small things. We finally decided to get married, and for one brief, shining moment, I thought maybe my life was about to become something peaceful. The engagement party was held at Luke's parents' country club. It was the kind of place with polished floors, heavy curtains, and silent staff who appeared exactly when you needed them. There were business partners, family friends, relatives I hadn't met yet, and every important person in Luke's world gathered under one roof. I was nervous enough already, trying to make a good impression and not trip over my own feet. Then Gina arrived. She came in already drunk, gliding through the room in a sequin dress that looked like she had mistaken the event for an award show. She wasn't just dressed to be noticed, she was dressed to dominate the room. She kissed cheeks too long, laughed too loudly, and interrupted people mid-sentence to deliver jokes nobody had asked for. At first, people were polite, that polite smile people wear when they're not sure if they were being entertained or endangered. Halfway through dinner, she stood up and tapped her glass. Nobody had invited her to speak. That never mattered to Gina. She launched into a speech about how proud she was that I had found someone willing to marry me, despite everything. She stretched that last phrase out with a grin, like a magician about to reveal a trick. I felt my stomach tighten. Then she said she had a funny story about why she never expected this day to happen at all. And she told them about the worst moment of my life. Not briefly, not delicately, not even vaguely respectfully. She performed it. She mimicked my voice when I was 19 and falling apart. She pretended to cry, then laughed at herself for crying. She acted out me begging her for help. She described me saying I wanted to die. And she repeated those words with a grin, as if they belonged in a club monologue instead of a suicide crisis. She told the room she found me with pills. She described rushing me to the hospital. She made a sound effect for the heart monitor. She even dropped to the floor and sprawled there to show how I collapsed. You know that feeling when a room gets so quiet it almost rings. That was this room. Nobody laughed. Luke's mother had tears in her eyes. His father looked sick. One of his brothers stood up and walked out without a word. Someone near the back stared at the table like they might throw up. Gina, of course, mistook the silence for suspense. She kept going. She said the funniest part was when I told the psychiatrist I felt worthless, and he apparently replied, "Well, at least you're self-aware." She laughed at her own joke, loud and proud, while the whole room sat in complete horror. Luke had no idea any of this existed. I had never told him. I planned to, eventually, because in a real relationship you don't get to hide the worst pieces of your history forever. But I wanted that conversation to happen in private, with love and care, not in front of 200 people, while my mother used my pain like party entertainment. Gina finally noticed no one was laughing. She blinked, looked around the room, and said, "Tough crowd." Then she sat down like she had just delivered a killer set. Luke's family left right after that. Some of them stopped speaking to me. A few still look at me like I'm unstable, like they can see something broken in me just because they met the woman who raised me. Luke almost called off the engagement. It took months of couples therapy for him to understand that what happened to me was years behind me, that it had been a crisis, not a lifestyle, and that Gina was not a reliable narrator of my life. And Gina, she never apologized. Not really. She told me I was too sensitive. She told me comedy comes from truth. Then, in one of her next open mics, she used the engagement party story as material and complained that rich people have no sense of humor. She told me I should be grateful she made me memorable. That was her idea of love. Make them laugh, make them remember, make them hurt a little, if necessary. The wedding was 3 months later. By then, Gina had decided she would be giving a speech, whether I liked it or not. She started asking for embarrassing stories about Luke so the evening could be balanced. She bought a white sequin dress that looked suspiciously close to a wedding gown and said she needed to stand out in the photos. She kept saying, "You can stop the mother of the bride from talking." I told her she was not giving a speech. She laughed like I had just made a cute little joke. That was the moment something in me changed. Not because I suddenly became brave, not because I stopped being scared of her, because I finally understood that if I kept waiting for Gina to become the kind of mother she was never going to be, she would keep wrecking every important moment I had. So I decided she needed to feel, just once, what it was like to be the joke instead of the one holding the mic. The week before the wedding, I invited all her comedy friends to what she believed was my bachelorette party. She was thrilled. Gina thought I was finally accepting her world, finally giving her a stage in my life. She brought 15 people from her open mic circuit, a whole pack of wannabe comics, who all talked like they were one viral clip away from fame. They showed up with cheap energy and too much confidence, the kind of people who laugh before they've even heard the punchline, because they're desperate to be part of it. I told everyone I wanted to do a roast, but with a twist. We would roast our parents. Funny stories, embarrassing stories, the kind of chaos everybody thinks they can survive until it turns personal. Gina loved it. She said finally I was developing a real sense of humor. She went first, of course. She told stories from my childhood that made me sound pathetic, fragile, and weird. People chuckled out of habit. Then others shared their own stories. Some were actually funny, some were sweet. The room relaxed just enough to make Gina feel safe. Then it was my turn. I stood up with my drink in my hand and looked around at all those faces. Gina's face was lit with anticipation. She thought she was about to hear me make a few harmless jokes about childhood messes and family dysfunction. She had no idea. I started with the truth she had spent my entire life burying under punchlines. I told them she got pregnant with me at 17 by her married English teacher, Mr. Randolph. The room changed immediately. The air got thick. I said she blackmailed him for money until his wife found the letters. I said he killed himself after the truth came out. I said Gina kept the suicide note, the one that mentioned her by name, and hid it for years in a box under her bed. The smiles died. The comedians stopped shifting in their chairs. Nobody touched their drinks. I kept going. I told them how she gave me vodka in my baby bottle when she wanted me quiet so she could party, how she brought strange men home and told me to be nice to them because they paid the rent, how she stole my college fund from my grandmother's inheritance and spent it on comedy classes she never finished. I told them she had been fired from 12 jobs for stealing. I told them she had gone to rehab 4 times and walked out each time because they wouldn't let her perform in group therapy. I told them she showed up at my high school drunk so often the principal called child services. I told them she told the social worker I was lying for attention. The room had gone so quiet it felt like a church after a funeral. Gina tried to laugh. I kept going. I talked about my 8th grade talent show, the night she got so drunk she fell off her chair and had to be helped to the parking lot by other parents while I pretended not to know her. I told them I found her passed out in the bathtub with a cigarette that burned a hole in the shower curtain. I told them that one Christmas she sold my Nintendo for drug money and told me Santa wasn't real anymore because we were too poor. One by one, the room began to shift. Ted stood up first and walked out without saying a word. Lucy stared at Gina with her mouth open, like she had just watched a car crash and was trying to understand how it happened. Kira held her phone up the whole time, recording every second. I could see the red light. I knew it was still on. For a few seconds, I felt pure, bright vindication. Like electricity running through my chest. Hot, sharp, powerful. And then something colder followed right behind it, because her face had changed. Gina looked stunned, not angry, not smug, not witty, actually stunned. Her makeup had gone pale under the lights. Her mouth had gone dry. Her hands shook so badly she had to put down her drink. The confidence she wore like perfume had evaporated. That was the moment I felt it. Not triumph, not relief, something uglier. I had just detonated my mother in front of the people who were her whole world, and watching it happen made me feel less victorious than filthy. I had kicked the dog and told myself it was justice. She tried to save herself with a laugh, but it cracked halfway through and came out sounding like a cough. She said I was lying. The word came out thin, weak, desperate. She said I was exaggerating everything for attention, that I always did that I always made her look worse than she was. But her hands were still shaking, and the room had already made up its mind. Greg, one of her comedy friends, cleared his throat and suggested we all take a break, maybe get some air. Nobody argued. People started filing out in awkward silence, chairs scraping, shoes dragging, murmurs dying before they could become actual words. In less than 2 minutes, the room emptied. It was just me and Gina left sitting across from each other at a table covered in half-finished drinks and crumpled napkins. She looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time, not with her usual smug confidence, not with a punchline in the chamber, with fear. She asked why I would do that to her. Her voice was so small it almost didn't sound like her. I told her she did it to herself the moment she turned my suicide attempt into a performance in front of 200 people. The words came out flat, cold, hard, her face folded. She started crying, but not the fake theatrical crying she used when she wanted sympathy. This was messier, uglier. Her mascara ran in dark streaks down her cheeks. She said I had ruined her reputation in the comedy community. She said those people were her only friends. She said I had taken away the one thing that made her feel like she mattered. I stood up while she was still talking. I grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair. She kept saying my name, kept telling me to wait, to listen, to let her explain. I walked out anyway. The hallway outside the private room felt too bright, too clean, too quiet. I could still hear her crying through the door behind me, and I didn't feel good. That was the worst part. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel healed. I didn't feel like I had finally won. I felt tired. I felt mean. I felt like I had swallowed glass. Luke called me 3 times that night. I let every call go to voicemail. I sat on my couch staring at his name lighting up my phone over and over, my stomach twisting tighter each time the screen lit up. I didn't know how to explain what I had just done, not in a way that would make me sound sane. The next morning, I listened to the voicemails. Luke sounded worried, confused. Careful. He asked if I was okay. He said Gina had called him crying about how I attacked her in public. On the 3rd message, he said his mother was asking questions and he didn't know what to tell her. That made something hot and violent surge up in me again. Of course, Gina had already called him. Of course she was telling her version first. Of course she had made herself the victim before the story even had time to breathe. She probably told him I was cruel, unstable, that I had humiliated her for no reason, that she was only trying to be a good mother. I threw my phone across the room. It hit the wall so hard the case cracked and left a mark in the paint. The next afternoon, Luke and I met for coffee near his office. I got there early and ordered something I barely touched. Luke walked in looking exhausted, his eyes shadowed, his face drawn like he hadn't slept. We sat in a corner. I told him everything before Gina could twist it any further. I told him about the fake bachelorette party, about inviting her comedy friends, about the roast, about every filthy truth I had dumped on the table. I told him about Mr. Randolph, the vodka, the stolen money, the rehab exits, the lies, the humiliation, the years of being her material. Luke listened without interrupting. His coffee went cold. His expression got heavier by the minute. When I finished, he sat Then he asked a question that hit me harder than anything Gina had ever said. Did I feel better now that I had hurt her back? I opened my mouth and nothing came out. Because the honest answer was no. I didn't feel better. I felt sick. I felt scared. I felt like maybe I was standing on the same road she had been walking for years, and I just hadn't realized how easy it was to step onto it. Luke said his parents were wondering if we should postpone the wedding. That one almost made me panic on the spot. My hands started shaking. I had spent months planning this wedding. Flowers, seating charts, cake tastings, arguments with vendors, tiny details that I had clung to because they were proof I could build something stable and beautiful. I had imagined that day more than once when my life felt like a mess. I needed it. I needed this to be mine. I couldn't let Gina take this too. Luke told me his mother was still rattled from the engagement party. She couldn't handle another public spectacle. His father thought maybe we should wait until my family situation was more stable. The word stable almost made me laugh. My family had never been stable. Not once. Waiting for it to become stable would mean never getting married at all. Then Gina showed up at my apartment 2 days later. She didn't call first. I looked through the peephole and almost didn't open the door. She looked wrecked. Not in her usual dramatic way. No glitter, no sequins. No performance-ready smile. Her hair was unwashed and pulled back badly. She wore sweatpants and an old t-shirt. She looked like someone who had forgotten how to hold herself up. When I opened the door, she walked in without asking and sat down on my couch like her legs had stopped working. She told me 2 comedy clubs had uninvited her from open mics after word spread about what I'd said. One told her they were going in a different direction. Another said they were full for the next 6 months. I felt the tiniest flicker of guilt. Then I remembered her sprawled on the floor at my engagement party, making sound effects for a heart monitor, while Luke's grandmother sat there in shock, and his business partners stared like they wanted to vanish through the carpet. Gina looked at me and, for once, didn't try to joke. She admitted the story about Mr. Randolph was true. She said she got pregnant by her married English teacher when she was 17. She said she blackmailed him for money until his wife found the letters. She said she had carried guilt about his death for 27 years. She said she still had nightmares about his wife calling her a murderer at the funeral. Then she said something that made the room go still inside me. She said she had been 17 and stupid and didn't understand that blackmail could push someone to the edge. She said his suicide note mentioned her by name. She said she kept it hidden in a box under her bed all these years. I just stared at her. Gina had never admitted anything in her life if she could avoid it. Never took responsibility. Never offered remorse unless it could be turned into a manipulation tactic. So I didn't know what to do with this version of her. Was it truth? Was it guilt? Was it just another performance, except quieter? Luke's parents invited both of us to dinner at their house to clear the air before the wedding. I knew that meant something closer to a test than a meal. Gina promised she would behave. She promised she would apologize properly. She said she understood how serious things were now. I didn't trust her. Not for a second. But Luke said this dinner mattered to his family, and his mother was still unsure whether she could support our marriage after everything that had happened. So I went. I spent the drive feeling like I might throw up. Gina arrived separately in her beat-up car. wearing a plain black dress that looked almost funereal. We walked to the house together in silence. I could feel her trembling beside me. The dinner started awkward and only got worse. Luke's mother was coldly polite, in the refined, controlled way people get when they absolutely hate you, but still know how to hold a wine glass. His father barely spoke. He cut his food in neat little motions that somehow looked angry. Gina started her apology well enough. Then, naturally, it drifted toward excuses. Hard childhood, single mother, no support, too much pressure, too much pain. Luke's mother let her go on for maybe 2 minutes before cutting her off cleanly and saying that plenty of people have hard lives without using their children's trauma as entertainment. The room froze. Gina's face went red, then pale. Luke's father set down his fork and asked if she planned to turn his son's wedding into material too. If she'd already started writing jokes about their family in her head. The question was so direct, it almost made me defend her for a second. Almost. But he was right to ask. Gina opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. Nothing came out. Her breathing turned shallow. She gripped the edge of the table with both hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was small in a way I had never heard before. She said yes. She said she had been a terrible mother. She said she knew it even when she was doing it. She said she couldn't stop herself because making people laugh was the only time she ever felt like she mattered. Nobody answered for a moment. Then Luke's father asked the question again, slower this time. Was she planning to use the wedding as material? Was she already writing jokes about this dinner right now? Gina shook her head, tears beginning to fall. Real tears. Not staged. Not dramatic. Not designed to control the room. She promised she would not give a speech at the wedding. She promised she would not joke about our family. She said she understood she had already done enough damage. Luke's mother set down her glass with a sharp click and told her that wasn't enough. She said Gina needed to understand she was on very thin ice with their family, and one more incident would mean she would never be welcome around them again. I felt something strange twist in my chest. Not forgiveness, something weaker and messier. Pity, maybe, or the beginning of it. Then I heard myself say, "She's still my mother. She'll be at the wedding." The room turned toward me. Luke looked surprised. His mother looked shocked. His father frowned like I had just made a dangerous mistake. Maybe I had. But I couldn't say I wanted her there and then take it back, just because it would have been easier not to decide. Luke drove me home afterward in silence. We sat in the car outside my apartment while the engine ticked as it cooled. He turned to me and asked whether I actually wanted Gina at the wedding, or whether I was only saying yes because I felt trapped. I didn't have an answer right away. That was the truth. I had spent so long being angry at her that I hadn't stopped to ask what I wanted underneath the anger. Luke told me it was okay to uninvite her if I needed to feel safe on our wedding day. He said his family would understand. He said they would back me either way. I told him I needed time. He kissed my forehead and said he'd call me tomorrow. I went inside, lay on the couch, and stared at the ceiling for hours. I kept replaying dinner in my head. Luke's face, his mother's tone, my own voice saying Gina would be there. I kept asking myself what was underneath all that rage. 3 days passed before I could think clearly again. I barely left my apartment. I ordered food. I stared at my phone. I looked at Gina's contact name and thought about every humiliation, every boundary she crossed, every time she turned my pain into a routine. But I also thought about the wedding. If she wasn't there, everyone would ask why. Everyone would speculate. The day could still get pulled into her orbit, just in a different way. I didn't want the story of my marriage to become a story about who got excluded, so I called her. She answered on the first ring, like she had been waiting by the phone. I told her she could come to the wedding, but there would be rules. No speech, no jokes about me, no jokes about our family, and if she drank too much, my cousin would escort her out without discussion. She agreed immediately. No arguing, no bargaining, no little side comments. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made me nervous. 3 days later, the wedding planner called while I was at work. I could hear panic in her voice before she even explained why. Gina had contacted her directly and asked about microphone access during the reception. She wanted to know the setup. She wanted to know when would be the best time to use it. My stomach dropped so fast I had to grip my desk. She had promised. She had looked me in the eye, or close enough, and promised. I left work early and drove straight to Gina's apartment. No warning, no text, no call. She opened the door in sweatpants, hair a mess, and before she could say anything, I pushed past her into the living room. When I confronted her about the wedding planner, she lifted both hands and claimed she only wanted to sing a song, not a speech. A musical tribute. A musical tribute. I stared at her and asked if she honestly thought I was stupid enough to believe that. She said I was being paranoid. I told her I knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted a spotlight. She wanted a way to turn my wedding into her stage. I stood in her messy living room, surrounded by scattered notebooks and stained coffee mugs, and told her that if she did one thing at that wedding to pull attention onto herself, I would never speak to her again. She started crying She said I was being cruel. She said she only wanted to celebrate her only daughter's wedding. She said I was treating her like a criminal. I did not soften. I told her that her idea of celebration had always been humiliation, that I would not let her do it this time. She sank onto the couch and covered her face. For a second, I almost felt bad. Then I thought of the engagement party, and I thought of her acting out my suicide attempt for laughs. I left without saying goodbye. Luke agreed with me that the situation had crossed into we need a plan territory. He suggested hiring security specifically for Gina. It sounded extreme, and yet, somehow, it didn't. His parents called while we were discussing it, and when Luke told them what had happened, they offered to pay. They didn't trust Gina either, so that was how far we had come. Security at my wedding, because of my mother, because I could not trust the woman who gave birth to me not to turn my marriage into a stage act. We spent the evening calling companies, explaining the situation, planning where the guards would stand, deciding who would intervene if Gina tried anything. It was humiliating to have to do that, but there was also relief in it. At least now I was building a fence. 3 days before the wedding, Ted messaged me. Ted was one of Gina's comedy friends. He had been at the fake bachelorette party, sitting in the back with the other hopefuls and half-talent comedians who thought they were one bad night away from being famous. His message said he needed to tell me something important. He asked if we could meet for coffee. I almost ignored him. Then I didn't. He arrived looking uncomfortable and guilty, stirring his drink so long it nearly turned to foam. Finally, he told me Gina had been calling all her comedy friends, trying to get them to come to the wedding and support her. He said it looked like she was planning something. He said he thought I should know. He also said he felt bad for not speaking up sooner about how she treated people. I thanked him and left the cafe with my heart sinking. Of course she was still trying. Of course she wasn't done. I drove straight to Gina's apartment again. This time I didn't wait for an invitation. I accused her of inviting her comedy friends to my wedding. She broke down immediately, but not the fake, polished version I had spent my whole life seeing. This was ugly sobbing, the kind that shakes the whole body. She admitted she couldn't stand the idea of being alone at an event where everyone judged her. She said she knew she had damaged our relationship. She said she knew she had gone too far, but she was still my mother, and she was terrified of being completely shut out. That hit me harder than I expected, because I could hate her when she was being awful. But when she looked this broken, it got complicated. She said she didn't know how to be at my wedding without her friends as a buffer. She said she was scared of facing Luke's family alone after everything she had done. The next day, Luke and I had an emergency therapy session. I admitted something I had been too ashamed to say out loud. I was afraid of becoming like Gina, afraid that one day I'd hurt people and then dress it up as fairness. The therapist asked me what I did when I realized I might be hurting someone. I said I felt guilty. I said I hated it. I said I wanted to stop. The therapist nodded and pointed out that Gina never did that. Gina never questioned herself. Gina never sat with the impact of what she'd done. The fact that I was terrified of becoming her meant I already wasn't her. Luke took my hand. He said he loved me. He said he trusted me. But he needed to know I would not use his vulnerabilities against him the way Gina had used mine. I promised him I wouldn't, and I meant it. But I also knew I had already crossed a line by exposing Gina's secrets the way I had. I needed to figure out how to do better than that, not just be less damaged. Better. We left therapy with a plan, boundaries, security, a path forward, and still I couldn't shake the feeling that something would go wrong. That night, the night before the wedding, I sat at my kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper in front of me. Luke was at his parents' house for some pre-wedding family ritual, so the apartment was completely mine. I picked up the pen, put it down, picked it up again. I did that 3 times before I finally started writing. The letter was messy and honest. I told Gina she could come to the wedding, but only if she brought one person from her comedy circle, someone who would keep her grounded instead of encouraging her to perform. I told her our relationship was broken, and I didn't know whether it could be fixed. I told her I was willing to try if she could respect actual boundaries. I told her I needed space to build my marriage without always wondering when I'd become material for her next set. That was the hardest part, because at the end, I had to admit something I barely wanted to say to myself. I still wanted a mother. Not Gina as she was. A mother, someone steady, someone safe, someone who would have protected me instead of laughing at me. Maybe that woman had never existed. Maybe she never would. I sealed the envelope and left it on the counter, planning to drop it off in the morning. I barely slept. I kept seeing Gina's face from the fake bachelorette party. The moment I revealed everything, the moment her confidence shattered. I kept wondering whether I had gone too far, or whether, for the first time in her life, she had finally understood what humiliation felt like. The next morning, I was in the bathroom trying to get my makeup right when someone knocked on my apartment door. Luke wasn't supposed to come for another 2 hours. I opened the door and found Gina standing there with my letter in her hand. Her eyes were red, but not in her usual dramatic way. She looked smaller, almost deflated. She asked if she could come in. I almost said no. Then I stepped aside. She walked into the living room and sat on my couch, holding the letter with both hands like it might break. She said she had read it 4 times. She said she understood what I was telling her. She said she had spent her entire life using comedy to avoid real feelings. Her voice cracked when she told me she was going to start actual therapy. Not the kind where she performed for the therapist. Not the kind where she turned her pain into bits. Real therapy. She said she didn't expect forgiveness. She didn't expect trust. She just wanted to try to become better, even if it was too late for us to have anything like a normal mother-daughter relationship. I stood near the door, not knowing what to say, because this was the first time Gina had ever apologized, without wrapping it in an excuse. The first time she had ever sounded smaller than her own ego. She wiped her eyes and said she was proud of me for setting boundaries. Then she said she wished someone had taught her how to do that when she was young. I told her she needed to leave so I could finish getting ready. She nodded and stood. At the door, she turned back and said she would sit quietly in the 3rd row with Lucy, who had agreed to be her support person for the day. The ceremony took place at a garden venue Luke's parents had chosen. White chairs, flower-covered arch, sunlight filtering through the trees. The kind of setting people photograph and frame in their memory. I stood in the bridal suite with my bridesmaids while the coordinator kept giving us our cues. Every few seconds I thought about Gina sitting out there in the audience and felt my stomach knot. Luke's mother had barely spoken to me at rehearsal dinner. His father kept giving me these worried looks, like he expected chaos to explode at any second. Then the music began. I walked down the aisle and kept my eyes fixed on Luke's face. That was all I could do. Gina was exactly where she said she would be, in the 3rd row, wearing a simple blue dress instead of the white sequin nightmare she had bought months earlier. Lucy sat beside her with a hand lightly on her arm. Gina's face was wet with tears, but she stayed still. She stayed quiet. The ceremony was beautiful in a way I had almost stopped believing in. Luke said his vows. I said mine. Nobody interrupted. Nobody made a scene. Nobody turned it into a performance. At the reception, I watched from across the room as Gina walked up to Luke's parents' table. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see it. No jokes, no wild gestures, no dramatic expressions. Just a woman speaking carefully, almost painfully, to people who did not trust her. Luke's mother stayed stiff and formal. Luke's father shook Gina's hand at the end. They weren't friends. They weren't pretending to be, but they were civil. And for my family, that felt almost miraculous. Something loosened in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, not peace either, just the beginning of being able to breathe without waiting for disaster. 6 weeks after the wedding, Gina and I started meeting for coffee every Thursday morning at a cafe halfway between our apartments. The first few times were awkward enough to make my teeth ache. We sat across from each other like diplomats negotiating a shaky ceasefire. I made a list of off-limits topics, things she could not ask about, things she could not turn into material. She followed the rules. That alone felt strange. She told me about therapy in a real voice. No performance, no exaggeration, no act. She said her therapist had pointed out that she had used comedy like a weapon, keeping people at a distance by shocking them first. If she made them laugh, or if she embarrassed them before they could embarrass her, then she never had to risk actual closeness. I listened. I didn't rush to comfort her. I didn't tell her it was okay. I didn't pretend the damage was less than it was. I just let her talk. Sometimes she asked about the wedding. I told her safe things. She didn't interrupt. She didn't joke. She didn't turn any of it into a story. Our relationship was never going to be easy. There was too much wreckage behind us. Too many years spent turning pain into entertainment. Too many wounds that would never close neatly. But I was learning something important. Protecting myself did not require destroying her. I could set boundaries without becoming her. I could refuse the role she gave me without turning into a person who only knew how to hurt back. Luke and I were building a life together in our new apartment. A real one. With boxes still unpacked and dishes that didn't quite match and plants we kept trying not to kill. I still flinched when my phone rang and her name appeared on the screen. I still worried she might slip back into old habits. But for now, 1 coffee a week, with rules and distance and a little bit of hope, was enough. And that was the strangest part. For years, I thought freedom would feel like revenge, like watching her finally get what she deserved. But real freedom turned out to be quieter than that. It was waking up and not wondering when I would become her next punchline. It was knowing I could love someone and still protect myself. It was learning that I did not have to become cruel just because I had been hurt by cruelty. If this story hit home for you, make sure you like the video and follow for more stories like this. There are so many people who grow up learning that pain is something to perform, and sometimes the hardest thing in the world is deciding not to keep the cycle going.